very synthetic nutshell, what happened in the Mars trilogy is that 100 scientists were sent to Mars in a mission, and they had to perform a terraformation in Mars. They should make Mars similar to Earth, change the composition of the atmosphere, produce fertile soil, and things like that. And why? If we take seriously what Frank Chalmers said, Frank Chalmers was an important character in the novel, and he was the most Machiavellian of all, so I take seriously when he talks about power. He said that the American and Russian states, who were decadent at this time, around 2020, they were decadent, but they had the technology of space travel, so they could try to go to Mars to exploit the mineral resources of Mars. In this situation, then, you had 100 scientists, each one with their own specialties. For example, Saxe Frag-Russell, a physicist, the most important terraformer; Nadia Chernyshevsky, an engineer, the one who was responsible to build infrastructure, cities, and so on; Vlad Teniv, an ecological economist; Frank Chalmers and Maya Totovna, political scientist; Michel Duval, psychologist, and many others. But things go in very, very different ways than what was imagined by the American and Russian states. Basically, what happened, the way that they organized themselves, very much resembled what the old socialist or communist model, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. Each one with his own abilities and with his own needs. They organized in a way that very much resembled as an utopia of scientists. But on Mars, that's incredible, but it happened. So what are my goal here, I will focus on political economy. Of course, there are many dimensions that I will not touch here. There are many dimensions that could be analyzed by psychoanalysts or by more properly literary critic people, people who work with literary criticism. I'll here focus on the political economy and what Martian theory and the world ecology perspective can offer us to understand why did we have such an extraordinary thing happening in Mars. Two revolutions happened in Mars throughout the trilogy. So the first thing, I identified four tendencies that could be used to explain what happened in the novel. One is, as Jason Moore theorizes, the capitalist exploitation of mineral resources, or commodity frontier. Expansion of the world economy to an area that was previously not part of the capitalist world economy, and historically it was structurally connected to slave labor, like cotton plantations in America, or Sicilian sulfur mines, in which you had also slave-like labor, and many other examples in the history of capitalism. Another element we can use Marx here, if you read Capital, you know about Mr. Peel. Mr. Peel in the 19th century, he was British, and he moved to Australia, and to the Swan River district, and he took with him his means of production, his machines, and his workers. It was a complete failure, because there were lots of free land in Australia, and it made no sense at all for those workers to keep on working for the capitalists. They just started producing their own food in the free land, and it was a complete failure for him, a complete success for the free proletariats. Mars has some elements of this. Mars, in Robinson's Mars, in my view. Another element is the organic composition of capital in Marxian terms, or the intensive use of machinery, of high technology machinery. According to Marx, in the Grundrisse, there is a fragment called the Fragment on the Machines, if you read, in which Marx says that when you have a lot of machines compared with human labor, direct human labor, manual labor, then production, commodity production, or production based on socially necessary labor time starts to crumble. And on Mars, you had a situation in which Nadia, the engineer, at some point she said, well, starting with an air miner, it was a machine that just distilled the air into its components, with an air miner, starting with an air miner, a computer, and some software, I can just build everything. I can build the infrastructures, I can build the cities, I can build everything with this machine. So it's a situation with a very high organic composition of capital. And this is tendentially crumbling value relations, value as a social form. And the fourth tendency is, of course, the inhospitable environment. There is no fertile soil in Mars initially. There is no breathable atmosphere. This forced them to, on the one hand, force them to think politically. How do we want to transform Mars? Or do we want to transform Mars in the first place? And secondly, it made them more vulnerable to capitalist powers from Earth, because they could not do like the workers of Mr. Peel. There was no fertile land around to go there and plant their own food. You were constrained to the tented cities and to infrastructures that were subject to meta-nationals, a higher stage of multinationals, and to UNOMA, an authoritarian version of the UN. So I already talked about the three of them. About soil and atmosphere, that's very interesting. You have what some people call an estrangement effect here, because what we take kind of for granted, fertile soil on Earth, it's an extraordinary thing actually. Nadia the engineer, was very surprised that she just could not manufacture soil, such a thing that we consider so basic on Earth. And she's such a complex ecology, it's a quote from the book, such complex ecologies could not be manufactured in the way that Nadia had been imagining. Then, on Mars, another thing that was related to this is that there was a huge political dispute among the Martians, not only between Mars and Earth, but in Mars. Basically, you had a split between the greens, the reds, and the greens. The greens were the ones that were for terraforming, like changing the composition of the atmosphere, producing soil, and so on. But we also had the reds. The reds were what conservationists would be on Earth. They were in favor of keeping Mars as Mars, were originally keeping Mars as red Mars. They saw an intrinsic beauty in Mars, an intrinsic beauty in Martian rocks, in Martian geography, in Martian landscape. So there was a dispute there. There was one particular character, which I selected here. She was the responsible for the construction of a space elevator. A space elevator would be a structure that would make it cheap to transport minerals from Mars to a satellite of Mars, and then made it cheap to send these minerals to the Earth. The manager her name was Phyllis Boyle. It's the only one, or I think the only one of the first 100 settlers of Mars, that aligned with Terran capitalist powers. This is a quote from her. Earth was seriously depleted in many of the metals they were finding on Mars. There were fortunes to be made, enormous fortunes. So this space elevator would actually made feasible for capitalist powers on Earth to turn Mars into a commodity frontier, just like the Mississippi Valley in the 19th century and so many other commodity frontiers. So, in my view, using these tendencies and counter-tendencies of political economy in this Martian situation, there was a tension developing in the novel in Mars, a tension between turning Mars into a capitalist commodity frontier, incorporating Mars in the world economy, and Mars as a new social form, as something completely different. My favorite character, Arkady Bogdanov. If you know who the real Bogdanov is, you know that the name is not a coincidence. He was to the left of Lenin in revolutionary Russia. He was very conscious of this tension, and this is a quote from him. He said, "The little scientific station, a kind of utopian scientific station, the little scientific station is being turned into a mine." So he was very conscious of what was happening. Terran powers, or the capitalist powers from Earth, were trying to turn Mars into a commodity frontier with the construction of this space elevator. Then, I hope you know that Kim Robinson is not this very dystopian guy, that what prevailed, I hope this is not too much of a spoil, what prevailed in the end was the tendency towards a new form of society, fortunately. I see 4 at least, many more, but at least 4 ways in which you can see in the novel how the tendency towards a new form of society prevailed. What I call the decomposition of value relations. First was the dissolution of these real abstractions of society and nature. There's a nice quote from John Boone, a very important character in Red Mars. He says, "We terraform Mars, but Mars aeroforms us." Aeroforms, Ares stands for the god that represents Mars. So he's saying we transform this planet, but this planet transforms us. And it's a form of reconciliation between society and nature on Mars, which is amazing. The political disputes, I remember the reds and the greens here, they are not mediated by commodified relations anymore. So greens and reds, they write a constitution, and their views are embedded in the institutions and on the planet, on the oikos. The powers, what would be somewhat equivalent to terran powers, the judiciary and the executive, they agreed that the executive would be predominantly carried on by the Greens, the terraformers, but the judiciary would be predominantly carried on by the Reds, the conservationists. And they achieved this kind of balance in which both visions could exist. But this was also reflected on the planet itself, on the biophysics of the planet. They reached an agreement in which, up to a certain altitude, terraforming was allowed. You could change the composition of the atmosphere, you could introduce new forms of life, and so on. But higher, in higher altitudes, the idea was to keep the original Martian landscape. So the political institutions and the biophysics, the aerial biophysics of the planet were integrated again. Of course, in the Constitution, communal land is there established, the owning of means of production by workers' cooperatives. And what I think it's very interesting, by the same time that Robinson was writing this book, the Zapatistas were saying, in the world, we want many worlds to fit. I see that at the same time, Robinson was writing a novel in which this was there in literary form. In Mars is not, Robinson's Mars is not a kind of totalizing utopia in which there's one single principle that defines everything, like we have in capitalism, we have value. In Mars you can find ecological economics, but you can also find gift economy. There's an important character who was born on Mars, who coordinates some kind of gift economy. When they had a very difficult time, they had to recede towards the poles and live in caves, he was coordinating a gift economy. You also had cooperatives. You had anarchists. You had the Bogdanovists had a project of anarchist architecture in which you could only have circular buildings so that you didn't have hierarchies embedded within your architecture. You had even primitivist communities in Mars. And you had an important character who represented some kind of devotion to life, some more mystical view, although she was also a scientist, Hiroko. She was an ecological engineer. So it was a kind of utopia of utopias, or a world in which many worlds fit, on Mars. And here, coming back to Janine's play, both Boyle, remember Boyle was the manager of the space elevator, the one who wanted to produce cheap minerals. Both Boyle and Musk, they can only think through the lens of the commodity or value relations. Boyle wants to produce cheap minerals, and Musk wants to produce cheap space travel. Two different kinds of commodity, but they are both commodity, and they cannot think outside of this box. They only think about value relations. Boyle says, an extraordinarily cheap method, strategic metals which are becoming ever more scarce on Earth, a cheap lift and push like this is literally invaluable. It creates the possibility of an exchange that wasn't economically viable before. And Musk, can people pay for this trip? Or cut the cost of moving to Mars? Or a steep price to pay for a ticket, $2 billion, $10 billion, I don't know. And it's a fun frontier, of course, with a shortage of labor power, so slavery would fit very well there. just like in Commodity Frontiers. So, to finish, I would like to show a map here, but on Mars there was a place called Blochshoffnung, which is German for the hope of Bloch. If you read Ernst Bloch, the German philosopher, he theorized utopia not as something very distant in the future, as something unattainable or rigid or fixed, but as something that is present here and now. Utopia as a not yet. So this is a nice hinting at this in the book. There's also Nirgal, a character that I already mentioned. He visits Mars. He visits Earth. Sorry, he was born in Mars, but he visits Earth. And he says Mars is a mirror in which Terra sees its own essence. So I think Kim's book serves as this estrangement effect when it says that, well, revolution is possible on Mars. It actually means, well, revolution is possible on Earth. And playing with this Bloch perspective, I would say Bloch tells about the not yet. Maybe with Robinson's book, we can say not here yet. But, well, yes, if it's possible on Earth, it's because if you can imagine on Mars, it's because it's possible on Earth. And there's also an estrangement effect when Janine uses exactly the words of Elon Musk, and by changing over the scenario, we can feel strange about it again, to treat planets as commodities. We should never have stopped seeing this as strange, or our life in general to be treated as value relations, or as a form of commodification or accumulation of capital. So that's it. I hope